Sechtes Peah, Perek Zayin, Mishnah Aleph. Kol Zayis Sheyesh Leishem Basada, any olive tree that has reputation in the field as having a distinctive quality. These Mishnahs are going to discuss the halachas of shikha that apply to trees. The same way that grain that is overlooked and is not harvested is shikha, a tree that's overlooked and not picked is shikha as well, as we explained in the Hakdoma. Afilu Kazais and a type of Beshaita, even if it has such a quality, only sometimes, such as an olive tree that drips oil during the time that it's fruitful. At times it produces olives so juicy that oil drips from them even without being squeezed. And if someone forgot to harvest such a tree, it's not shikha, and he may go back and harvest it. Since this tree has a unique feature, the owner will eventually remember it, and it's not shikha. Even if he forgot this tree during a year when it's not so fruitful, since it has a distinctive reputation, it's not shikha. And as we learned in the previous parak, the halachas of shikha apply only to produce that the owner has forgotten and is unlikely to remember. If a forgotten tree had this distinctive feature that makes it stand out from the rest of the orchard, it's not shikha because the owner will presumably remember it and come back for it. Bamedvar Mamurim, what are we talking about? Meaning, what makes a tree unique in this regard? B'shmai. So one of the things is that when one of the things that's unique about it is because of its name, Ubim because of its productivity, because of the location in the orchard. Bishmai means that it produces so much oil, that it's called by its own distinct name, such as a shevchaini, one that pours oil, or baishani, one that shames. It produces so much oil that it shames the surrounding trees that produce less. Shevchani and baishani are two different names for the same kind of tree. Some would call it shevchaini and some would call it baishani because of the way it would produce the olives. B'maisav, it was unique because of its productivity, that it produces many more olives than the trees around it. And b'mkaimai, unique because the location means it's in a memorable spot. For example, it stands next to the wine press or next to a gap in the fence. So such a tree would be remembered as the tree next to the wine press or the tree next to the gap. Ushar kalazesim, regarding all other regular olive trees, shnaim shikha. If someone forgot to harvest two trees, they are shikha, and he must leave the fruits for the poor. Ushleisha ain't shikha, but if he forgot to harvest three trees, they are not shikha. Just as two forgotten bundles of grain are shikha, but three are not, as was mentioned in the previous parak, so too, two forgotten trees are shikha, but three are not. The Mishnah refers to a person who forgot to harvest an entire tree. The next Mishnah will discuss a person who forgets to harvest part of the tree. Rabbi Yossi says, Ein shikha l'zeisim, the rules of shikha do not apply to any olive tree, even ordinary ones, because olive trees are so rare that they're all considered distinctive enough that they will certainly be remembered. Rabbi Yossi said this halacha after Hordes destroyed much of Eretz Yisrael and eliminated most of its olive trees. So olive trees became so rare that if a farmer had an olive tree, he would certainly remember to harvest it even if he forgot it originally. Therefore, the olive trees in those days were not subject to the laws of shikha at all. Rabbi Yossi agrees, though, that in a time when olive trees are common, that they are subject to shikha. And it's just interesting that Rabbi Yossi is saying, Ein shikha l'zeisim. We know the Gemara at the end of Harius and Yud Gimel Amud Beis says that a person who eats too many zeisim forgets his learning. And Mirz Hashem will discuss this in a future shir. Mishnah Beis. Zayis shenim sa'amid ben shalosh shurei shal shnei malbinim. An olive tree that's located standing in the midst of three rows of trees, and it's in the middle tree in the middle row that are separated from each other by two strips of land. The farmer forgot to harvest this tree, and it's not shikha because it was not forgotten due to forgetfulness, because it was hidden by the trees around it. And as we learned two prakim ago in Parag Hey, the forgotten produce is shikha only if it was left behind because of forgetfulness and not for other reasons, meaning if it was overlooked because it was blocked or hidden, that's not considered shikha. Zayis sheyesh b'sasayim. If an olive tree contains two saw of peris, and the farmer forgot to harvest it, ain't shikha. It's not shikha because two saw does not become shikha, just as two saw is the limit for shikha of grain, as we learned in the previous parak. The previous Mishnah taught that trees with a distinctive reputation do not become shikha. This Mishnah teaches when such trees do become shikha. When was it said that a tree with a reputation does not become shikha? When the person harvesting the surrounding trees did not begin to harvest the tree with this reputation. But if he began to harvest that tree, even if it's a tree with a reputation such as an olive tree that drips oil when it's fruitful, if you forgot to finish harvesting it, it is subject to the laws of shikha like any other tree, and the fruits that he forgot must be left for the poor. When a tree is unique, the farmer will not skip it completely. Once he starts to harvest it, though, he might not remember to finish it. If a person forgets some fruit on a tree, it does not become shikha until he finishes harvesting that tree and leaves. The Mishnah explains that as long as the farmer has olives beneath the tree that still need to be gathered, he has the right to go back and collect the olives that he forgot at the top of the tree. Until he collects all the olives from under the tree, he has not yet finished harvesting that tree, and the fruit that was forgotten on the tree are not shikha. Once he removes the olives from the ground and thus finishes with this tree, any olives forgotten on the tree are shikha, and he may not return to collect them. Rameir says, even after the fruit is cleared from the ground, the fruits that were forgotten at the top of the tree do not become shikha until the worker who searches for hidden fruit has left. Only then is the farmer finished with the tree, and the fruit forgotten on it are shikha. After the harvester finished picking the fruit, a worker would bang on the tree with a stick to loosen any olives that were hidden amongst the branches. Mishnah Gimel. Ezehu Peret. What is Peret? The Torah commands a person who harvests his vineyard to leave the poor, the aniyim, a gift known as Peret, which we mentioned in the beginning. So Ezehu Peret, what is Peret? Hanosha b'shas habetzira. It's the grapes that fall during the harvest. That is, the individual grapes that fall from the cluster while it's being picked, they must be left for the aniyim. Haya baitzer, if somebody was harvesting the grapes, only grapes that fall because of the harvest are Peret. If you cut a cluster, if it got tangled in the leaves of the vine and fell from his hand to the ground, and the grapes became separated from the cluster, the separated grapes belong to the owner. They are not Peret since they did not fall because of the harvest, that is, as a result of the ordinary process of plucking the clusters from the vines, but rather as a result of getting tangled in the leaves. Peret is comparable to leket, stalks of grain that fall as a result of the grain harvest. Just as the stalks that fall because of an outside factor are not leket, as we learned in Perek Daled, so grapes that fall because of an outside factor are not considered Peret. The Mishnah discusses a person who tries to avoid giving Peret to the aniyim. If someone places a basket beneath the grapevine when he harvests the grapes in order to catch any grapes that fall and keep them for himself, he's stealing from the aniyim. This person wrongly assumes that the fallen grapes do not become Peret until they reach the ground. Thus, he places the basket beneath them, reasoning that if the grapes do not hit the ground because they'll land in the basket instead, they won't become Peret and he may keep them. The Mishnah teaches that this person is mistaken. The grapes become Peret on the property of the aniyim as soon as they separate from the cluster. By the time they land in the basket, they are already Peret. If he collects them in his own basket, he's stealing from the poor. And about this the pasuk says, Al tasik v'l olam, do not violate the boundary of the poor, as mentioned in Perek Hey. That is, do not withhold from the poor that which is rightfully theirs. And as we know, as we spoke, that it's possible even in a person's own property to steal matnas daniyan. Ezehu oilelos. So, in addition, Mishnah Daled, Ezehu oilelos. In addition to the requirement of Peret, the person who harvests his vineyard must leave on the vine certain underdeveloped clusters of grapes for the aniyim. These clusters are known as oilelos, singular oileles. Right? This Mishnah describes what's considered oilelos and what's not. A fully developed cluster of grapes consists of a central stem with small bunches of grapes growing from the top and numerous individual grapes growing from the bottom. Oilelos are clusters that do not have this formation. So what's oilelos? That you have to leave for the aniyim. Kol she'ein lo kosef v'lo notev. Any cluster that has neither shoulder, that is, the many bunches of grapes that usually cover the top of the cluster stem. At the top of the cluster, small branches extend from the stem, each with a small bunch of grapes. When the cluster is thick, with these bunches, they're called shoulders. They're called kosef because the bunches rest upon each other as a package rests on a person's shoulders. Nor dripping. Notev is a lashon to drip. That is, the many individual grapes that usually extend from the lower part of the stem. At the bottom of a cluster, the grapes do not grow on small branches, but directly on the central stem. When the cluster is thick with these grapes, they appear to drip down from the end of the cluster. Therefore, they are called drippings, notev. If a cluster is so underdeveloped that it lacks this formation of grapes, that is, the cluster contains only a few scattered grapes, the top of the cluster is not thick with bunches resting on each other, and the bottom of the cluster does not have grapes that look like they're dripping down from the stem, so obviously all clusters of grapes are underdeveloped while they are growing. Oilelos are clusters that remain underdeveloped at the time of the harvest when the rest of the vineyard has finished growing already. So, kol she'ein lo kosef v'lo notev, it's considered an oilelos and it must be left for the aniyim. But if a cluster has either a shoulder or it looks like it's dripping on the bottom and it doesn't have anything else, it's not an oilelos and it belongs to the owner of the vineyard, it belongs to the baal bayis. Im safek la'aniyim. If there's any doubt whether the cluster has these characteristics, it belongs to the poor. Im safek la'aniyim. For example, the cluster contains small bunches of grapes that appear to be resting on each other, but they are not as close together as the bunches in an ordinary cluster. So it's questionable whether this cluster has a kosef. We learned in Perek Daled that whenever there's a suffix, if something is leket, it's considered full-fledged leket. The same applies to oilalois as well as with all the other matnasanim. If there's a doubt whether a cluster is a singular oilelas, it's considered an oilelas as well. Oilelas sheb arkuva, if an oilelas is on a loaded branch, meaning a branch that also contains fully developed clusters, the halach is as follows: Im nekretes im ha'eshkol. If the oilelas is close enough to the other clusters that it's cut from the vine together with the other clusters, that is, the harvester cuts off the entire branch at once, harehi shabalabais, the whole branch including the oilelas belong to the owner, from la verei shalaniim. But if the oilelas is far enough from the other clusters that it's not cut together with them, but is picked by itself, it belongs to the aniyim. If it's so close to an ordinary cluster that they are harvested together, the oilelas is considered part of the other cluster and not an underdeveloped cluster of its own. As we have mentioned, so garger yechidi, if instead of small bunches, individual grapes make up the top of a cluster, and these individual grapes rest on one another. So as we mentioned, the shoulder, a kosef, is a small bunches of grapes at the top of the cluster which rest on another. So the Mishnah now is going to discuss a cluster with a different kind of formation. If the top of the cluster is thick with grapes resting on one another, however, instead of bunches resting on one another, as in an ordinary cluster, there are only individual grapes resting on each other. So Rabbi Yehuda Eimer Eshkol, Rabbi Yehuda says that it's considered a normal cluster, not an oilelos, and it belongs to the owner. Since the grapes rest on one another, the cluster has a kosef. The Chachamim Eimer oilelos, and the Chachamim say that it is an oilelos and it must be left for the aniyim. According to the Chachamim, the definition of a kosef is small bunches that rest on each other. If a cluster has only individual grapes that rest on each other, it lacks the din of a kosef, and it's considered an oilelos, as long as it also does not have noteif with it as well. Mishnah Hey, Hamedel Bagfanim, if somebody is thinning out his grapevines, that means that he uproots some of the vines to allow the rest to grow better. If vines grow too close together, they prevent one another from reaching their full growth. Thus, at times, the owner of a vineyard uproots some of the vines to allow the remaining vines to grow better. Just as he thins out his own vines, so may he thin out those of the poor, which means that he may uproot extra vines even if they contain oilelos on it, and so you would think it might belong to the aniyim, so he won't be able to do that, but the Mishnah is saying that he is allowed to do that. Rabbi Yehuda, that is what Rabbi Yehuda holds. Although the oilelos belongs to the poor, the owner may treat them just as he treats the property of a partner, and a person who owns a vineyard with a partner may perform maintenance on the vines, such as being madel them, thinning them out without consulting his partner. However, he may not remove only the oilelos. He's permitted only to thin out branches with oilelos, so that other branches with oilelos will grow better. Rameir says he's allowed to thin out his own vines, but he's not allowed to thin out those of the poor. He may not thin out vines that contain oilelos. Rameir holds that the poor are not considered partners in the vineyard. Rather, they must be treated as a person who purchased part of the vineyard. It's like a separate owner. If the farmer sold some vines to someone else, he would not be allowed to thin those vines without the buyer's permission. So too, he may not thin out the vines belonging to the poor. This machlekes applies to peah as well. A person must leave peah from his vineyard just as from his field. If a person designated a certain vine or vines as peah, Rabbi Yehuda and Rameir will argue whether he may remove those vines if he needs to do so to thin out the vineyard. Mishnah Vav. Karam Revai. So what is Karam Revai? So a fruit that grows on a tree during the fourth year after it's planted is called Revai. The owner must bring this fruit to Yerushalayim and eat it there. Fruit that grows on a tree during its first 3 years are Orla, which one may not benefit or eat from at all. So our Mishnah discusses the fruit of the fourth year. If he cannot do so, if he cannot bring the fruit up to Yerushalayim and eat it there, he must be paid the fruit by exchanging it for money, which he brings to Yerushalayim and uses it to buy food to eat over there. The halachas of Revai are very similar to those of Ma'aser Sheni, which is one of the portions that must be separated from produce that grows in Eretz Yisrael. Ma'aser Sheni also must be eaten in Yerushalayim or be nivda onto money that's used to buy food in Yerushalayim. So our Mishnah, which also appears in Ma'aser Sheni Perek Hey and in Edis Perek Daled, considers whether Revai resembles Ma'aser Sheni regarding two other halachas as well, meaning the halacha of a chaimesh, whether the owner who redeems his produce with his own money must add a chaimesh. A person can redeem Ma'aser Sheni either by selling it to another person or by exchanging it for his own money. However, when he uses his own money, he needs to add a chaimesh. The chaimish mentioned here is a chaimish of the new total. That means that if, for example, the produce was worth 4 shkalim, he pays 5 shkalim, thereby adding a fifth of the total. And the halacha of beer, that it must be removed from the house before Pesach on the 4th and the 7th years of the Shemitah cycle. The Torah tells us that on the 4th and 7th year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, a person must be mekayim the mitzvah of beer maasros. At this time, he must make sure that all the maaser from the past 3 years are either given to the proper recipients or destroyed. If maaser sheni or money, which maaser sheni was redeemed with, had not been properly used by that time, it must be destroyed. Generally, the time to do this mitzvah is Erev Pesach. So Karam Ravai, the produce of the 4th year of a vineyard, it's not subject to the laws of chaimesh or to the halachas of beer. The Torah does not say that a person must add a chaimesh when being paida Ravai, or that a person must be mevair, do beer for Ravai before Pesach in the 4th and 7th year. It just says that these laws are in connection with Ma'aser Sheni. And although Ravai shares some laws with Ma'aser Sheni, it doesn't share these halachas. Beis Hillel say yeshlei. It is subject to the laws of the chaimesh and the halacha of beer. The Torah says in regarding to Ravai that in the 4th year all the fruits shall be sanctified to praise Hashem. The same word sanctifies appears in the pasuk by Ma'aser Sheni as well. So according to Beis Hillel, they use the same word in both verses, creates gzera shava between them, which teaches that just as Ma'aser Sheni is subject to the halachas of chaimesh and beer, so to Ravai is mechuyev in chaimesh and beer. Beis Hillel yalvi kodesh mimaiser. Beis Hillel learn out kodesh mimaiser. Ma maiser yesh lechaimesh yesh lebeer. Av kam Ravai yesh lechaimesh yesh lebeer. Beis Shammai yalvi kodesh mimaiser. Beis Shammai don't have this gzera shava of kodesh mimaiser by Ravai. Beis Shammai say yesh le peret v'yesh le oilelos. If the 4th year produce of a vineyard is subject to the halachas of peret and oilelos, just like the produce of any other year. And the poor people who collect the peret and the oilelos of the 4th year of the vineyard must redeem it for themselves if they do not want to take it up to Yerushalayim. Beis Hillel say kulei lagas, all of it goes to the wine press. That means that the entire 4th year harvest, including the peret and oilelos, may be kept by the owner, and he's allowed to put all the grapes in the wine press to turn them into wine without leaving any for the aniyim. He's then part of the wine and takes it to Yerushalayim. As we mentioned previously, Beis Hillel hold that Ravai is mechuyev in the same halachas as Ma'aser Sheni. So Beis Hillel also hold that Ma'aser Sheni does not belong to the owner of the land, rather it's kodesh, which the Torah commands him to eat in Yerushalayim. The halacha is that kodesh, if something is kodesh, it's hektish, it's kodesh, it's parted from peret and oilelos and other matnas aniyim. So therefore, because it's kodesh, Ravai is not subject to any of these halachas. The owner of the Ravai gathers the entire crop, including all the matnas aniyim, which is peret, oilelos, peah, and shikha, and takes it to Yerushalayim and eats it there, and is paida it there. Mishnah Zayah. Karim shekulei oilelos, a vineyard that's entirely made up of oilelos, that all the clusters are underdeveloped. Every cluster in the vineyard does not have a kasef or a natef. So Rabbi Lezer Emer Labalavayis. Rabbi Lezer says that everything belongs to the owner. Rabbi Kiva Emer La'aniyim, but Rabbi Kiva says everything belongs to the poor. Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Kiva are arguing about how to understand the pasuk, because the pasuk says in 2 places that we have to leave oilelos for the poor. Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Kiva each base their opinion on one of these psukim. Rabbi Lezer said, Kisiv tzar loisa oilel. The Torah says when you harvest your vineyard, you shall not take the oilelos. This means that the issur of taking oilelos applies only when you're harvesting your vineyard. But if there's nothing for you to harvest, that is, that the entire vineyard is underdeveloped, and you leave it all for the poor, where will the chiyuv of giving oilelos to the poor come from? So according to Rabbi Lezer, the minimum that's considered a harvest for this purpose is 3 fully developed clusters, which are large enough to produce a revius of wine. If the vineyard produces less than this, the owner may keep the oilelos. Amar Rabbi Kiva said to Rabbi Lezer, "V'karma chalois oilel." The pasuk says, "V'karma chalois oilel." This pasuk doesn't mention that the harvest does not mention the harvest, and implies that you may not keep the oilelos no matter what. Afilu kula oilelos, even if the vineyard is entirely made up of oilelos and there are no non-oilelos to gather together. Im kain, if it's true that the owner may never take oilelos, even if they make up the entire vineyard, so lama nemar kisiv tzar lois oilel. Why does the pasuk say in Devarim, when you harvest your vineyard, you shall not take the oilelos, which implies that the halacha of oilelos applies only when there is a harvest? So the Mishnah explains, Ein la'aniyim ba'olulais kodim habatir. According to Rebbe Kiva, the Torah mentions the harvest to teach another halacha, that the aniyim have no claim, have no rights on the olulais before the time of the harvest. Even if the owner has no fully developed clusters to harvest, the poor may not take the olulais until the harvest season arrives. And how does Rebbe Lezer interpret the pasuk in Vayikra? So he explains that it's teaching another halacha. Although the aniyim may not take the olulais until the batzi or until the harvest, the owner may not take them for himself before that time either. B'kitzer, Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Kiva understand the Torah's two psukim about olulais like this. So the pasuk in Devarim that says, when you harvest your vineyard, you shall not take the olulais. So Rebbe Lezer says, if you have a harvest for yourself, you may not take the olulais. If not, you may keep them. And the pasuk in Vayikra that says, you shall not take the olulais of your vineyard, that Rebbe Lezer understands. You may not take your olulais of your vineyard even before the time of the harvest, even though the poor may not take them yet either. Rebbe Kiva says that the pasuk in Devarim is saying at the time of the harvest and not earlier, the poor may take the olulais. And the pasuk in Vayikra is telling us that you may not take the olulais of your vineyard regardless of whether there will be a harvest or not. Mishnah Ches. Hamakdish karma achlei noidu by olulais. Something that's hektish is not mechuyev in matnas aniyim, as was mentioned a few times previously. The Mishnah discusses the halachas when a person is makdish his vineyard to hektish when the grapes are growing. So hamakdish karmei achlei noidu by olulais. If someone is makdish his field to the Beis Hamikdash before the olulais can be identified, that's when the clusters of grapes are too small to tell which ones will develop properly and which ones will remain underdeveloped. So ein olulais la'aniyim. So the olulais do not belong to the aniyim. By the time they become olulais, the vineyard belongs to the hektish, and the property of hektish is pater from the halacha of olulais. Before the olulais can be discerned, the entire vineyard, including the undiscernible olulais, belong to the owner, and he may make it hektish. If some of the clusters develop into olulais, they have done so as a property of hektish, and therefore do not have to be left for the poor. But misha noidu by ha'olulais, however, if a person was makdish his kerem, person was makdish his vineyard, after the olulais can already be identified, that is, after the grapes have developed enough to tell which are olulais and which ones are not, ha'olulais la'aniyim, the olulais belong to the poor. As soon as it's clear which clusters are olulais, those clusters belong to the poor. Since the owner does not own them, he cannot give them to hektish, and they remain the property of the poor. Although the poor may not actually take the olulais until the time of the harvest arrives, as we learned in the previous Mishnah, the olulais belong to the poor as soon as it's clear that they are olulais. Rabbi Yossi says if he was makdish the vineyard after the olulais are recognizable, although the poor may take the olulais, they must give hektish the value of the growth from the time that they were hektish until the time that they were collected. That is the difference between their value now and the amount they were worth when the vineyard became hektish. Although the olulais belong to the aniyim, they draw nourishment from the vines and the soil that now belong to hektish, and the aniyim have to pay hektish for this. On top of this, there's other halachas of parrot and olulais. There are halachas of shikha that apply to a vineyard as well. So there are grapes that are forgotten in the vineyard that must be left for the aniyim. So the Mishnah discusses when forgotten grapes become shikha in different types of vineyards. What is shikha in the case of an aris with an ayin, which means that you have a lattice and the vines are spread across wooden frames? So at what point is a grape considered to be forgotten in such a vineyard? Whenever the harvester forgets a grape and moves far enough that he can no longer stretch out his hand and take it. However, as long as he can still reach the forgotten grape, it's not considered forgotten. Since these vines are intertwined, the farmer is not considered to have finished with the vine until he has moved so far that he cannot reach it, as we mentioned in previous Mishnayos, in this parak and in the previous parakim, that forgotten fruit does not become shikha until the harvester leaves it behind and moves on. If he has not yet left and can collect the forgotten fruit without turning back, it's not shikha. And these halachas seem a little bit different than the halachas of other trees as mentioned in Mishnah Beis. And with regard to vines that are spread out on the ground, a forgotten grape is shikha as soon as the farmer passes it, even if he's still close enough to stretch out his hand and reach it. Here, each vine is distinct and separate. So once the harvester moves past the vine, he has finished with it, and its forgotten fruits are shikha.